Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Godward Podcast. Now, Godward Podcast was recommended to me by one of my subscribers. I think Brundlefly was his name. And it was about like a couple of weeks ago he brought that up. And then so now we're here. So thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Todd. You can call me Casey too. It works fine for me.
All right. So yeah, you had some points to prepare to talk about church history and the intersection with that. So what have you looked in that direction?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say, I've liked your channel for, a couple of years, it seems, and I admire your seriousness. And it seems, were you trained in history, or is this just a hobby for you?
Well, I got a bachelor's
history degree.
Yeah.
So I came to history kind of later in life. It wasn't until I was probably 35 that I got interested in history after my academic work was in literature. But this confluence of Christianity and, I guess, especially in the first century, of Christian history and sort of Roman Greek politics at the time grows on me. The older I get, the more interesting it becomes. And so in the last about 2 years, I've read through things like, Justin Martyr and Athanasius and Tertullian and Eusebius and Bede. And I guess to me, the picture that I'm coming away with is that there's a alternative history that exists kind of parallel to the history that I think increasingly almost everyone knows, which is the history that's delivered to us by way of the Enlightenment. So even Christians nowadays seem to be almost fully under this, even woke Christians, even Christians who think they know what's going on, and even Christians who have read Foucault and will say they understand, about different narratives and stuff, they still seem to sort of gain their focus through this Enlightenment sort of, Edward Gibbon style history of the first century, when, as I suggest, there is this whole other super rich trove of stuff that, you can read Bernard of Clairvaux, or you can read Boethius or whatever. And this is what people did read, it seems, up until the Enlightenment. And so, well, I guess I would put the question to you. For me, it's this almost like revelation late in life, it seems. I'm 43 now, but I was probably 35 or so before this ever occurred to me. I'm surprised that Christians don't seem generally very aware of this. You'll find some Catholics, the ones who seem to be interested in super traditional Catholicism or something, who will dig into this stuff. But it seems to me that if we're going to be Christians, we ought to go all the way and contend that, no, seriously, these miracles really happened and that this is what matters rather than this, whereas, again, this Enlightenment history where it's slavery and the Holocaust and American history and those kinds of things are the chief historical events that we're supposed to pay attention to. I don't know. It's just interesting to learn about a different way of thinking about history. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, yeah. I think a lot of this is the post-war consensus. So if we look at the funding that was devoted to STEM field research in the academy, it was 1,000 times greater per unit than social sciences and history. And so partly over the last 60, 70 years, history has been really seen as it's not been seen as profitable. All the money, all the propaganda, all the advertising goes to STEM. And so I think we have a broader, which of course is why the new atheists can then come out and talk about history. Well, they're they're experts in their own fields, but not in history. But it doesn't matter because STEM trumps history and the sort of public consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of Christians have got that idea too, because there's this sort of post-1945 consensus where instead of having history more like the unique American story of settler colonists, it becomes the citizen of the world Enlightenment ideal that the United States, begins in World War I with the League of Nations, trying to build a global community that failed. And then we succeeded after World War II with the United Nations. And so now we have this globalist perspective rather than even an American perspective in history.
Right.
Which up until 1945 we would have had. If you got a history book prior to 1945, it starts with Columbus, right? It's American history, then the Pilgrims, then the Western expansion, then the Civil War, then the industrialization, then World War I. So it was still more like America. And you would even find books like, Europe, Mother of America. I remember from my late maternal grandmother, she had a book called, for when she was a kid, called Europe, the Mother of America. Mm-hmm. And that was something that, she would have read and taught when she was a teacher. But that was, again, before World War II, long time ago. So I think to contextualize all of this, the first thing is that there is this overall diminishing of history in the public consciousness. And so Christians, one of the things we've also seen, and this is not just Protestant v. Catholic, it's, I think, modern Christians in general, they want to be relevant. They want to appear to be relevant. They want to engage with the culture. And if the culture as a whole doesn't value history, in order to then, in these people's minds, engage culture, then they're going to diminish history as well, because the society doesn't value it. Now, in a positive sense, as a reaction to the new atheists, we have seen a strong, rebuttal of a strong argument for the historical Jesus from people like Gary Habermas and T. Wright, where they sort of go and refute the Jesus seminar, the Jesus myth, all of these, new atheist or progressive rewriting of first century history. So we do see a little bit of it there. But yeah, after like the historical Jesus, there's really a drop off of interest amongst Christian apologetics in the history of the church. Another denomination that might, I think, be interested in church history would be certain kinds of reform branches of Christianity. So, for example, like Doug Wilson's outfit in Christ Church, he's also one of the co-sponsors of classical education. So, like Roman Roads Press. Yeah. And then there's a Catholic branch, Memoria Press, which is, but they both are operating in this more holistic understanding. Now, I think they both leave something to be desired. They don't cover as much as I think they should, but at least they seem to be beginning to asking the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like you're telling a great example here, like the book that your grandmother gave you of kind of like particularist American history. And that's kind of what I would have grown up with. Even I can remember traces of that, usually from older books or like from my dad's books from, 2 generations ago or so. But like the example that I used in one of my episodes that I was rewatching a chunk today was, so you can take somebody like Clement of Alexandria, like about whom almost like myself and none of my viewers would know anything about him. But like, if you ask any of them or me about Abraham Lincoln, we can conjure up, between 6 and 10 details about the life of Lincoln. To me, this signifies, or this shows us that like we identify more with America than we do with Christian history. And I guess in my mind, that doesn't seem right. Like if we're going to, it seems like what this does is it kind of conflates the two identities. Whereas I think initially Christianity was kind of intended to create something like peoplehood almost. And that gets kind of displaced by, or like watered down by the American Empire, which seems to have been, and like, I know we can argue about this, but it almost seems to be designed to have done that. Like, I don't love blaming the American founders for everything. And sometimes like, I feel like people go a little hard on the Enlightenment and saying like the Enlightenment ruined everything. I think these people were trying, but the result is that, by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century or late, the Victorian period, you've got people who would have been critical or like skeptical or dismissive of something like Venerable Bede in the same way that we are. So that happened pretty early on after the Enlightenment, it seems to me. And I don't know, maybe it's really too difficult to get back to that sort of consciousness, right? Because Bede, if people haven't read Bede, reports miracles, as does Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th or so century. So it poses a real problem for us if we believe that there were miracles in our history all the way up until like now, but I like the way that this question kind of forces people to like choose, which side do you want to be on? Like, are you with America or are you sort of with the Christians here?
Yeah, I like the way you put that. Christians in the United States and in, I think, the broader Western world identify more with the particular country of birth they come from than they do with their religious denomination. Because, as you said, even it's only among trad cats that you find Catholics who really know church history. A lot of them are what they call, cafeteria Catholics. And yeah, while there are some Reformed Christians as well that would go deep into church history, sort of. Again, that's a very narrow group. Most Christians would identify with, the nation of birth that they come from. And, as far as miracles, it's not only just the fact that we have to accept that there were signs and wonders, performed by Christians, but also by the bad guys. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we can go back to Moses, where the two sorcerers of Pharaoh could conjure up miracles and signs and wonders.
Right. Yeah, good example.
And we also know that Antichrist could perform lying signs and wonders that could even deceive the elect. So I think what's really the problem is Christians in the modern world have become de facto cessationists. Mm-hmm. They may not admit that. If you actually ask them, they may not even say that, but they're de facto cessationists.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is, of course, being inundated with Enlightenment propaganda. Well, these miracles just can't happen. And so, they're predisposed to be skeptical of miracles.
And actually, that's why it helps to have that gap in our, like, this sort of foggy middle 500 years for most of us that, like, public education will just kind of gloss over. Because then you can kind of go like, well, even if you're a Christian, you can kind of imagine that, like, yeah, Moses did miracles and maybe, like through the book of Acts, maybe even to Joan of Arc, but then somewhere in there it stopped. And now we just live in the disenchanted world. And I guess, to me, like, again, kind of forcing the question back on people, it seems like it provokes good thought, I think, for Christians. And then I have one other sort of, flashpoint for all of this, which is a little different than this, but involves the same sources. I think I've seen, you've done episodes on like the Punic Wars, maybe a little bit, and Thucydides, right? If I remember right.
Yeah, we've done some stuff like that. Yeah.
And so, like, I read this in the last couple of years, some like Herodotus and Thucydides and Tacitus and Polybius and some of that stuff. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the impression that I got was that sort of on the eve of the coming of Christ, the world really was just basically constant war between various tribes who could not get along. In this sense, I think that, like, there was something very innovative going on when you see like the Achaean League start to happen, or the Delian League, or Rome, like which does seem to figure out a way to allow for complacent polytheism. At least, in other words, like, at least these different peoples, these different city-states begin to stop attacking each other constantly. If you remember from Thucydides, it's like they're almost just raising crops of young men to go die on the triremes as fast as possible at a certain point. And so, like, another aspect of all of this that's interesting to me is the very particular timing of the coming of Jesus and the beginning of Christianity, which from this other perspective, like, if you take into account these Greek sources, the early Roman sources, that, like, it appears that it was a kind of political solution right exactly when the world needed it worst. And the solution does seem to be, as I said in the previous point, something like well, how should I put it? Like, it helps people to imagine the possibility of peoplehood in ways that they hadn't previously. And the reason this point hasn't been, like, I've been trying to make this point for a year or so, and it hasn't been a big popular one. And the reason is that it moves in the direction of, like, globalism, in the direction of, like, from the local tribes, you begin to, so you have the Thessalonians and the Galatians and the Romans, And before this, they seem unable to sort of cooperate. But after Christianity, they begin to identify as a people for the first time. And like, I don't have the answer to this. Maybe we have to, what we're looking for is a way to stop that maybe halfway down a slippery slope. But I do think it's preferable to the world that we find on the eve of Christianity, which was just, it seems total chaos and killing constantly. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but I'd be interested.
Yeah, if we look at, say, like European history or the history of the Mediterranean basin, yeah, the scale of violent conflict ratchets up quite quickly. The first big splash is the Persian Wars with the Greeks. But then the Greeks, they get caught in their cycle of arms race throughout all the wars between Sparta and Athens. And then, Macedon with Alexander ratchets it up to the next level. And then the great successor wars after Alexander, where these massive armies, larger than anything that had been seen before, are tearing apart, Europe and Asia. And then those armies look small compared to what Carthage and Rome throw out. And yeah, there's these modes of organization that develop, culminating in the Republic of Rome, which allows for mass mobilization of all resources. And of course, that's why Rome wins. Rome can most efficiently mobilize all the resources at its disposal. The other states can't. Carthage is only, comes in second, but again, Rome has that extra edge. And what the Roman when it converts to the empire, which happens right around the time of Christ, is there is this perceived need for, on the one hand, within the broader pagan world, a sense of unity. All the wars, all the civil wars, and the emperor, who's a god, he styles himself as a god because he brought peace to the world, right? And he brought peace through the fear of the legions. And then in Israel, there's the desire for liberation because the Maccabees had been destroyed by the Romans about 60 years before Christ. Pompey the Great conquered Judea. And so what we end up having is sort of two separate thrusts. One of liberation, which is what the Hebrews want, and then one of the sort of peace between the warring tribes, which is what the Roman Empire purports to bring. And Christianity says that we're going to give you both, but in a way that neither expects or really wants.
Yeah, that's well said. Well, another. Have you read Josephus's Jewish War?
I've not read Josephus.
It's so good. Like, I couldn't believe how good it was. I mean, I'd probably put it up there with Thucydides as like just such essential reading if you're trying to understand that first century. And the picture he draws, which is so interesting because he's Jewish by birth at least, and sort of becomes, you may know the story, he kind of gets like kidnapped or taken hostage or whatever, and he's sort of enlisted as Vespasian's like official historian of the empire. But he was, in his lifetime, was celebrated by Jews and Gentiles alike. I mean, he had a huge following. He was respected as like an unimpeachable historian of what's going on. And the picture he paints is that like basically Judea is tearing itself apart because of its own factionalism, like from within. You got these the zealots happening. You've got the Essenes doing their thing. The Pharisees trying to seize power, and then like as you said, the like I mean, I guess that's the zealots, but like the liberationist nationalist party happening. And so as Vespasian and then Titus like pull up to conquer Judea, like they don't even want to do it. They hardly have to do it. They just there's these like declarations. They say like, God witness that we're not doing this. They're doing it to themselves, basically. And at some points in that book, Josephus even says like, it appeared to me that God had shifted his favor from Jerusalem to the Romans, which like, I mean, I don't know what to make of that exactly. I don't know that Josephus like knows what God thinks, but it gives you a real sense that like those big changes that were happening in the first century, the life of Jesus, the destruction of the temple, probably all the way up through Hadrian's sort of totally wiping out Jerusalem, that like all of this feels like meta-historic or like theological, essentially. Like it's political change, but it's it's bigger than that almost. And I guess I feel like we're approaching a similar phase in history where, because all of our major assumptions now are up for grabs again, identities are shifting, people are moving around, there's contact with in ways that there hadn't been before, that the same confluence of, like, again, politics and whether you call it philosophy or theology is sort of happening again. And part of, I mean, at least what it looks like when you read that first century stuff is like, it almost, like, no one really understood, maybe Jesus understood, but very few understood what was happening sort of as it was happening, but it just revealed itself to people. So anyway, just very interesting. But yeah, I recommend Josephus too all the time.
Oh yeah, the ancient historians are some of the best. I mean, when growing up, I read Herodotus, Arrian, some Plutarch. I mean, there's so much of him; it's hard to read all of it. But yeah, what I would say, I think what's an interesting thing to sort of take this conversation in another direction is back to the sort of fact that history in general has taken, a second seat back to STEM and other things. And I think part of it is people don't see how history is useful. And one of the things that I find to be very useful about history, and by extension literature, is all of the things that we go through in our life today, the hard times, the good times, people went through that before. And a lot of the problems people, especially of my generation, millennials, they tend to think that the problem they're dealing with is the first time anyone's ever had to deal with it. And they kind of freak out. They don't know how to handle this particular issue. But if you read history, you realize that it may not be exactly the same as yours, but situations very, very similar to the one you're going through. People have gone through and survived. I mean, people don't understand. During the Dark Ages, there were Viking raids that burned villages to the ground, but people still somehow found a way to survive. We may not know what that way was because it's not written down or only in a few hard to find places. But, as of yet, the Vikings haven't burned everything down yet. That might happen, but even if it does, there's a way to get through it. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that.
Yeah, but I think you're right that there seem to be, like, what I guess it's like Spenglerian now, or it's really Platonic, these kind of cycles of history. This seems to be kind of generally better understood than when I was growing up, certainly. But there seem to be sort of generations that of people that don't experience the kinds of disorientation that I feel like people generally are experiencing now. I see it in 20-year-olds all the time. And my sense is that the combination of literature and history, actually reading both, I think, like, this is the kind of thing that can help to orient people, because ultimately what you're looking to discover is not so much like, or at least I guess this is my prescription. I would advise people not to look so much for, a list of, like, things to do exactly from the historians and from our favorite novels and so on, but to figure out kind of where you are in that cycle of civilization. And if you kind of start to recognize that, it gives you a sense, not so much of, like, I don't know, like how to live morally exactly, but as you said, like, you can kind of breathe through it and understand that it's all sort of temporary, and that really it's just like, it feels kind of mechanistic. I know sometimes I almost sound, like Marxist or Hegelian, talking like this as if it's all a big mechanism. But I mean, you kind of start to see the matrix a little bit, and it's certainly not, it doesn't have to be perfect corollaries all the time, but it echoes.
Or rhymes. Yeah.
Yeah, rhymes. Yeah.
And when it comes to sort of using history and literature to sort of apply it to one's life to learn lessons, when I was homeschooled, but in high school I read Shakespeare. Like, I read all of his tragedies, all of his histories, about half his comedies. And what you realize is that, like Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, literally everything you're reading about in Shakespeare, you can look at that and be like, I see this happening all the time right now. Stuff like that, So for example, you have Othello, where Diogo basically feeds him lies about Desdemona, so that spoiler alert, he kills Desdemona. And so what happens, right? Well, this manipulator finds Othello's weakness, and he just plays it. He just presses that button as hard as he can, right. And he plays him. And so many people get played because somebody knows how to read them and then feed them the information that they want. Because, throughout Othello, Iago is, creating these just so encounters that seem to add credence to what he's saying about Desdemona. And it creates this picture in Othello's head of betrayal. Mm-hmm. And I see that happen so many times with people I know, that they're being fed a line, and then that person is like crafting things for them to see to then help solidify that line they've been fed. And again, a lot of people, they are green behind the ears. And the main reason why we need to read history and literature is that all of the last 4,000 years of human experience, we can't live through. We can't.
Right.
The only way we're gonna learn that is by reading what they wrote and told us. Because it's impossible for us to live all those different experiences ourselves. And I think that's why modern man is so narrow and anemic and weak, is because he's only lived his own life. He hasn't, at least even vicariously lived in the lives of those that came before. Yeah. Which is what history and literature are meant to do.
Yeah, it's really an interesting thing to think about too. Once you get through, I don't know, 10 or 15 novels and 10 history books or something, you need a certain critical mass, but then you can start to reflect on what it's teaching you. Like for example, bringing up Shakespeare. I mean, I'm always struck when I read Shakespeare of the half of it seems perennial to me. Half of it seems nothing, like you said, nothing ever changes. In fact, he seems like a better psychologist than practicing professional academic psychologist now. Like, he understands better about the eternal things in human nature than seemingly most professors of psychology or something. But on the other hand, you have to also read those footnotes, because a lot of times you're like, well, what is this eating utensil that he's mentioning or something? There's figures of speech that don't hold up and so on. And I think, again, that's part of like the benefit of visiting this stuff, is you start to separate wheat from chaff. You start to see the things in life that are going to last. And it's things like you're suggesting, like the way that people interact with one another. These kinds of things, like psychology, I guess we call it now, but soulology at some level. And I think, with like when I read, or like we were actually, it's interesting you bring up Shakespeare. We mentioned before the show Moby Dick. Like, Moby Dick's one of my favorite books. Apparently Melville read almost all of Shakespeare the year that he was composing Moby Dick, and you hear it come through. Like some of the soliloquies that Ahab gives, they almost fall into like iambic pentameter, and maybe not even consciously. Like, I just think that sometimes when you read someone so much, you start to pick up some of their mannerisms and their vocabulary and their speech habits and so on. And like, to me, that's it's so amazing, the alchemy, the magic of it, that you're going to get like a book written 300 or 400 years apart that feels like it's in the lineage. You know what I mean? And like these kind, like, I don't know, to me, it's very valuable stuff. Anyway, the punctuation mark I want to put on that tirade is that that generally is not the stuff we're getting children in schools anymore. So there was this long dialogue or dialectic, this exchange, the anxiety of influence stuff, I guess, that Harold Bloom calls it. It's true, the note there about reading the Bible. And then it sort of stops, so that if you go to public school nowadays, all of a sudden you're reading like, The House on Mango Street or something by Sandra Cisneros, and it has no connection to the literary past or the histories that used to be taught. And so that's the literature. I guess on the history, I would say basically the same thing, which is that, you talked about visiting like everything that ever happened to ourselves. and of course we can't. But like, I'll go even further than that and say, history has to be edited, right? Like, too many things have happened. No one has the time to read it all. And so when we realize that we have to select, that we have to like give our focus to certain things in history, it becomes like very important that we have good curators, good archivists, good editors putting together books for us that ideally, in my opinion at least, are in touch with this long tradition that looks like a stairway with sense, and it kind of builds in a way that if you follow it, it helps you grow your soul. And I feel like, man, I don't know. I don't quite want to call it a conspiracy, but it feels almost intentionally taken from us,
Yeah, I like that turn of phrase, grow your soul. One of the things that I call this whole project, this whole collection of work, history, literature, the Bible, I call it the stream. And if you're in the stream, then you're sort of always involved in this information, in this truth, reflecting on it, reading it, and then it guides you as you go through life. So for example, you mentioned how literature is, I think it's unarguable that it has gotten terrible. Let's look at English literature, which I know the best. English lit technically begins with Beowulf, but there's a huge gap due to the Dark Ages. English literature really gets started with Chaucer in the 14th century. Then we get Malory with the Death of Arthur in the 15th. And then in the 16th, we get Shakespeare. In the 17th, we get Milton. In the 18th, we get the great English, novels like Robinson Crusoe and all that stuff. In the 19th century, there's just too many books to even mention of great English literature. And in the 20th century, it just goes to crap.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we have J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and T.H. White, and they're great. But as a whole, though, given what the 19th century produced, English literature in the 20th and certainly now in the 21st is dead. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the one reason we could look at is again the rise of STEM, right? The rise of STEM as the only field of study worth having. All of this poetry, all of this history, all this literature, it might be a nice little thing for people to do on the side, but that's not where the real world's at. That's not where, that's a totally different outlook than, say, the British Empire. In the 19th century, you read Roman literature because they're like, well, the last time there was a globe-spanning empire, it was Rome. Let's read what the Romans did and then apply that today. Now, that's, neither here nor there about whether the British Empire was good, but they understood that in order to maintain their authority, their power, they had to have their elite managers read history, read literature to see how you do it. But you see, the British Empire was run based on, at least early on, was run based on what they perceived to be the sort of essential eternal truths of the human experience. Whereas, say, the United States, as of the post-war era, is saying we're going to cast that all away. And we're going to just do it from scientific first principles, which work in some ways, but in other ways are totally inadequate.
This is, you probably at some point listened to some of the dialogue, or at least you've mentioned the New Atheist. So did you see any of those dialogues with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson? A couple of years ago?
Actually, no.
They're not bad. I mean, but because Peterson does keep his finger on the pressure point, which is this thing about like it's STEM basically. I mean, that's the word you're using to indicate something like materialist assumptions about like as the final foundation of everything. And to me, Harris is super annoying because it's like he wants to avoid like first principles or real metaphysics. Like he'll pay lip service to metaphysical stuff, but like ultimately, to make judgments, to have values, there's always a leap of faith there at the beginning, and he won't admit it. And so he's going to talk about like moral values stripped of he talks about religious history, but it's really Christianity that he hates. And so he wants to get rid of Christianity and says that like that will make us more moral people somehow. But as soon as you push him on like, well, what will that mean? How should we live? What is that? That Lenin question. What is to be done or something?
Yeah. What is to be done?
He can never give you specifics, of course, because he won't identify, first principles, because in order to find those, you need to have like a rock on which you sort of pin everything. And he doesn't have it, but he'll give us these kind of platitudes really just from Enlightenment thought. And it's frustrating to me. I don't know. Like I think a lot of I liked your timeline of English history stuff. I mean, another element of that to me is that I think after a while, if you stay in the stream, to use your terminology, long enough, you begin to identify stuff that's outside the stream as like all of a sudden the contrast is turned way up. So if you're reading like Chaucer or like recently I was reading Dostoevsky's Writer's Diary, and it's this really interesting kind of like random compendium of things going on in the 19th century. But like what shines through it first and foremost is his assumptions about things are not at all the sort of like post 2005 woke American version of values, right? Like he isn't doing that, and nor was Chaucer, nor was Shakespeare. And all of a sudden you start to see that like, wait, all these really important famous names that are in the Mortimer Adler's reading list or whatever, that these people all seem to agree on things. And then but like now my college sociology professor is telling me they were all wrong, and we finally got it right now, and this is what Sam Harris is telling us and stuff. And this is I don't know, to me it's an interesting challenge I wish everybody would sort of undertake. But again, it feels like the schools are intentionally kind of moving that stuff off stage so that the confrontation never happens, so you never realize that like, wait, well, I don't know, like, I won't mention specifics, but I think you get the idea.
Well, okay, as far as was there a conspiracy to get rid of this, there was, because Harold Bloom wrote in the 90s, The Closing of the American Mind, where there was a war on the classic traditional curricula by what we would today now call the woke advocates. I was very young when that was going on and didn't really follow it, though I kind of knew it was going on. And again, Bloom's book is the book that actually talks about that. And I think actually Harold Bloom wrote his own Western canon of all the essential books you had to read. And in fact, when I was much younger, I knew I liked to read. So one of the things that I thought was, well, I'll read books. And there were some books I really liked and some books I really didn't. And I started to wonder, like, well, what's the difference? In hindsight, I know the ones I didn't like tend to be more modern themes. Mm-hmm. But when you're like 15, you don't know that. And so no one actually ever told me this, but I just decided, well, I only have so much time to read, and I don't want to waste time reading bad books. Is there a list of just good books to read? And I stumbled across the canon, and I actually stumbled across Harold Bloom's list of all the great books you need to read. And I'm like, whoa, that's a lot of books. But I started curating my reading list by looking up the canon. And it's that Western canon that you have to read. And the Bible's in it. And the thing is, even people who aren't Christian still place the Bible in the Western canon. In fact, arguably, it's the first piece of the Western canon. It's before Homer. So what's also interesting is how not only how different people are, we think of their assumptions being different. But let's go back to like Shakespeare. You look at the way women are portrayed in Shakespeare and the way that they're portrayed today in fiction. In modern day fiction, they act just like men. So there's this confusion of gender roles and what exactly does it mean to be a woman anymore, which I think is also leading into transgenderism, because we have this gender confusion. What, does anything define a woman? Whereas in Shakespeare, right, because you see with the feminist critique, well, if you have women of the traditional kind, they're all going to be the same and one-dimensional. Which, that's not true. Shakespeare has a very wide cast of female characters, but also none of them are modern. None of them
Right.
are feminists. None of them are trying to, usurp authority in the way that we're accustomed to. And I think that's really interesting, because I think the change of older people and their assumptions and their behavior is even starker when you compare, say, the 16th century woman is portrayed in Shakespeare and a 21st century woman today. They're almost totally different species, almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, this one of my favorite memes is that, like, I'm old enough to remember meme, because it's true of me now at 43 years old, but it's like, I'm old enough to remember when, like, I don't know, like, marriage wasn't a violent institution, or, or whatever. And like, the interesting thing about the 19th century in particular is that's that century where, at least, yes, the Enlightenment and all its problems in the beginning of feminism and so on, but, like, at least it's self-conscious in the sense that, like, it's showing you those things. It's showing you, the new woman, and, it's sort of making you even more conscious of these reforms. And so you've got, like, the traditional and then the modern, and we're going to see how these things interact or whatever. But what we're getting now, as you said, and I think this is why it all reads as, like, to me, like, two-dimensional. Like, everything seems predictable and flat whenever I read, like, like a Jonathan Franzen novel or something, which I've basically stopped reading because I don't have time for it anymore. But whenever you visit one of those books, it's like there's no depth to it. It doesn't feel real, in the sense that reading, even if you go back, like, sometimes I used to teach Gilgamesh. So to the very beginning of literature, there's things in Gilgamesh that feel more profound psychologically than, Oprah Winfrey books that are sold today. And yeah, by the way, your recommendation about Harold Bloom, the canon, whoever you read, the Mortimer Adler is another one with a famous list about this. I mean, it's like, it's frustrating to have to even advocate for this, right? Because it's all that existed in a way before 1990 or something. Like, one of the sort of starting points for my intellectual life was when I was probably 16 or 17 and digging through the old, out in my dad's garage, like, just some old stuff. And I found his box of old college books. And my dad is not, like, he's not an intellectual. He just went to some regular college and was a basketball coach, but he had copies of Plato and Kierkegaard and Camus. And it was like, it was enough to get me up and running at the time, to read Thoreau or something when you're 15 or 16 years old. It's, for me, I was like, that was probably 1993 or 4. It was different enough from MTV, that it began to give me a perspective, like distance. And then I could, again, like, that forced the question on me, like, here's this civilization you live in, and then here's the stuff that the people who, even are still affirmed generally by this civilization to be great writers, great thinkers. And they're saying these apparently divergent things. So you have to kind of sort it out. And for me, I finally came down on the side of that tradition. And now the difficulty is that once you really sort of plant 2 feet solidly in that camp, you find yourself maybe more and more, like, it becomes difficult to vibe with, the mainstream music or movies or whatever. It just, a lot of it feels wrong to me.
Well, yeah, certainly the price of reading the canon and getting into the stream is that you can't fit into the modern world anymore. But, that just sort of begs the question, is the modern world something that really should exist as is, or should it be replaced with something else? But the one thing that the canon does give you, which the modern world does not, is that no matter what form of human society you have, there will always be suffering and hardship, and you have to get through it. And the Western canon will tell you how. Mm-hmm. It will show you how, because people have gone through much worse and come out on the other end. How did they do it? Whereas, you need to ask for help today. You're going to get some lousy shrink who's not going to be able to give you any actual advice on what is going on here. Now, this is something that I had thought up as a friend asked me a question about how do you read the Bible? So many people who profess to be Christians, sadly, have never read the Bible from cover to cover. I try to do it every year, and maybe I should even do it more than that. But a year seems to be the window to read the whole Bible through. And I was thinking, well, yeah, how would you sort of teach somebody to engage the Bible and learn how to interpret it and understand it? And this is a thought experiment I came up with, but I would like to get your take on it as a pedagogical device. So have the student read, say, the chapter of Romans, and then write down their thoughts. Okay, what do they think Paul is saying in Romans? Mm-hmm. Okay, and then that's the first part of the project. The second part of the project is to read historic commentaries on Romans. And I know John Chrysostom, Thomas Aquinas, Calvin, and Matthew Henry, Orthodox Catholic Reformed Baptist, all wrote commentaries on Romans. Read those, write down what you think they think Romans meant, and then the final part of the project would be, okay, after doing all that, what do you think about Romans now?
Yeah, I think that would be awesome. That's so. This year I homeschooled my daughters because the corona thing in the schools seemed all wrong. They're only 11 and 8, but when you do it that way, you have so much time. We read all the way through. What did we read this year? We read the whole of Genesis, Gospel of John, and Galatians, which is a particular favorite of mine. And we would just do, like you said, a chapter a day. It doesn't take very long to do that, and then just like sort of talk it over for a few minutes. Now I didn't have them read Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians or anything with me, but like for high school students or college students, I think that kind of thing is great. Like, I mean, the way I do it personally is I just am generally kind of always reading the New Testament in a cycle. So that, I don't know. I mean, I probably read it once and a half or twice a year. Just it's on my nightstand all the time. And then I try to read the first 5 books of the Old Testament every year. And so I've read that, I don't know, 10 times now or something. And I did the whole Bible in a year at least once. And then so I've probably read, the rest of the Tanakh stuff, I don't know, 2 or 3 times as I go. And a lot of times, you end up like searching through or something to find an interesting story. But I will say, like, I was talking to a buddy about this yesterday, a Catholic friend actually, and I was for some reason I mentioned Galatians, and Galatians is 6 chapters, and it takes exactly about 28 minutes to read. And I know what I said to him is I said, like, as Christians, like, we're supposed to believe that the Bible is given to us by God, and that, like, Paul's letters are inspired by the Holy Spirit. I mean, the Holy Spirit basically wrote these. And it does seem to me that, like, a surprising number of Christians are just like, well, I don't even have 28 minutes to read Galatians. You know what I mean? And it's like, how can you, that just doesn't even make sense to me. It seems like you're saying something, but then not acting like it at all. By the way, the reason I recommend Galatians is that I think it's the best example of like an argument in Paul's letters. I mean, Romans is up there too, but it's like, you just can't miss it. He gives it to you in like 2 chapter chunks, and it's a perfect, not oration, but, lecture basically. And sometimes like my Catholic friend said, well, you know what? I'm guilty. I don't often read through it cover to cover like that, but if you stick with the Catholic liturgy, you'll hear most of the Bible over the course of a year. And I mean, I didn't want to fight with him, but I'm kind of like, I don't think that really is the same thing, because as I say, with Paul or with the Gospels or whatever, like, these are intended, I mean, they're written to be read sequentially, like all at once. It's not asking a human that much to read for half an hour, but that's kind of the way that the text suggests it ought to be read. And so, I mean, I just don't know, like, to me, it's like, you're a Christian. Okay. Like, there's nothing better you can do than just spend a half an hour or what is it for Romans? It probably takes an hour. Like, you read it tomorrow. You should read Romans if you haven't read Romans,
Exactly. Yeah. Now, I'm getting in the message that you hate commentaries, but I think the importance here, though, is not so much to get your Bible from a commentary, but to sort of be aware of the historic depth of Christianity, right? From Chrysostom to
it's two things. It's two things for me. The joke from the chat is like a lot of times I don't love when modern commentator, like my favorite to pick on is Leo Strauss. I can't stand the way that Leo Strauss acolytes will accost you all the time if the topic of Plato comes up or something and be like, have you heard what, Strauss said? It's like, I don't care what Strauss said because I've read Plato enough that I know what it says. You know what I mean? Like you can do that. Now, it's different with the Bible because I think, first of all, I don't want to go, I'm not going full Jacques Derrida deconstructionism here, but it is true to say that some texts require like extra textual research, as you suggested. Like you have to sometimes read more about the period in which it was written, and then I think it sometimes does help. Like for me, for example, like one of my recent videos was on Justin Martyr in a very underappreciated early Christian work called Dialogue with Trypho, where he talks about the supersession of the old covenant by the new covenant. And so it's one of these things where, like, if you read that text and read it carefully, it was written in like 155 or so. First of all, it's a very clear argument. You can't mistake what he thinks about it. And then maybe you want to read like Tertullian and read Athanasius and Chrysostom on the same topic to give you like historical context. But what happens is if you read all that stuff and then you read like what's the like Schofield Bible commentary on it or something. Well, what you're going to get in the Schofield Bible is this claim that in like 1835 or so, all of a sudden it was discovered that Justin Martyr and Athanasius and Tertullian and Chrysostom were wrong. And then like in 1830, we finally figured out the truth of it, which is, this dual covenant theology stuff. And it's like, that's, to me, that is where like, it's actually very useful, even though like I come from a sort of Methodist, vaguely Protestant background, but I'm happy that, the Catholic or the Orthodox preserved these early texts for us, because I think it's important sometimes to understand like how, let's say, the Gospel of John was interpreted for the first 3 centuries after it was written. And it seems, if it's just that if you're going to disagree with those early interpretations, you got to be real sure about it, because that's a big claim then.
Yeah, and I think one thing, I guess now that we're nearing the end of the hour, that I think is a nice place to end here is with the Bible and with the canon of Western literature and with history, the great historians, like Thucydides or Arrian or Tacitus. These are the kinds of books that you don't just read once. They're meant to be read multiple times, and the benefit that you derive from reading it multiple times is, for example, last year I reread The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and the Space Trilogy, and there's stuff in there that you see new each time, because as your mind just sort of takes note of what you already read last time, it's not new anymore. Something else is new, because your mind has already compartmentalized that away. So each time you read it, you see something you didn't see before. You climbed a little higher up the hill, and you can see over the hill to see what's there. You read it again, maybe a year or 2 years later, 5 years later, you climb up the hill a little bit higher. And also, if you're reading books within this tradition, you might see higher over the hill if you read, say, C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, your third time, because you read something else. Maybe because you read Dostoevsky, and you can say, oh, I read something in Crime and Punishment that actually helps me understand what's going on over here.
Can't stress this enough. This is such a good point. Like for me, another place it started was Moby Dick, because if you read Moby Dick, Melville's always making references to the stream, to all this stuff from Western literature. And if you try to be a real careful reader of Moby Dick, you have to follow these threads, and that then you go like, well, he mentions Plotinus here. I'm going to have to give a go at the Aeneads or whatever. And like it all, there are these moments when you're reading this stuff where it all of a sudden reveals itself, and you're like, thank goodness that I revisited this. I thought this recently when I read the Odyssey again last year. I used to teach the Odyssey all the time, but when you're teaching it's hard to reread the whole thing because you're just in a hurry or whatever. But man, the Odyssey, like the older I get, the more I just feel like this is almost enough to have been the foundation of a civilization. Like you can see why they would teach it to their children. It could almost be the basis for like a morality when you understand the journey sort of out in the Iliad, and then this attempt to return home as, I don't know if you ever read, there's that poem by C.P. Cavafy called Ithaca, where it's like, keep Ithaca always on your mind. Arriving there is what you're destined for. Like the idea being that it's this archetypal, alienation from home and the long struggle to get back there. It's very, I mean, it's right in sync with the idea of the sort of out of Eden vibe and the yearning for heaven and so on. But you don't pick that up when you're a high school senior who's, assigned to read the Odyssey. And so, yeah, I mean, you get what you can when you're 18, when you're 22. Give it a go. Let yourself feel overwhelmed. It's okay to not understand. Like I'm 43 and I still can't really claim to understand, I don't know, like James Joyce. Like, I don't know if he's even good. It overwhelms me, but maybe it's my fault, and I'll revisit it in 10 years. I think that's okay. But yeah, great point there to end on if you like.
Yeah. And again, thanks again, Casey. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.